My name is Paige. I'm a 34-year-old housewife. I get along really well with my husband, Kevin. It's been 8 years since we got married. But even to this day, we're still totally in love like newlyweds in their honeymoon phase. However, there were two concerns that I had. The first concern was my mother-in-law, Mrs. Karen. In Kevin's family, it seemed that the men had a shorter lifespan, and my father-in-law had already passed away. Mrs. Karen lives together with her mother, my grandmother, Mrs. Tammy. We live in a distance that soup wouldn't go cold, so we normally go back and forth between their house and ours, but no matter what I try to do, I can't seem to get along with Mrs. Karen.
Paige, I heard that you and Kevin went to the fast food restaurant by the station the other day. I heard from Kevin.
Yes, I wanted to eat the limited edition burger that I saw in the commercial. It was delicious.
You shouldn't be going to fast food. You don't know what they put in that food.
Huh?
Listen up. When it comes to fast food and junk food, there are a lot of suspicious preservatives and fragrances. It's full of things that are bad for your body, and it's going to be a problem. You need to make sure that you're feeding Kevin proper food.
Sure.
Oh, come on, Mom. I was the one who said I wanted to eat it, and I asked Paige. And plus, a hamburger every now and then isn't...
A healthy lifestyle every day is what leads to a healthy body. Paige, you need to make sure that you are cooking homemade meals every day. Okay? You don't use any artificial ingredients or non-organic vegetables. You need to cook with the food that's made naturally.
Recently, because of the influence of television, Mrs. Karen is obsessed with Aloha's lifestyle. I don't mind that she is attempting Aloha's lifestyle, but I wish she wouldn't force that upon others.
Listen, Paige, if you use shampoo with silicone in it, then your hair follicles will get damaged with silicone. You need to wash your hair with natural soap from now on.
Oh no, but if I wash my hair with natural soap, it's going to become so dry and brittle. Miss Karen, these days there are non-silicone shampoos available.
You can't trust that! Natural soap is number one. Natural soap. When it comes to anything, natural is best. And also, if you use computers and cell phones, the radiation waves. Blah, 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 blah.
I just stared at Mrs. Karen's face as her mouth moved, and she blabbed on and on and on, and I let it all go in one ear and straight out the other. Even Kevin and Mrs. Tammy, who was sipping on her tea, knew that it wasn't going to be productive to say anything in between. So everybody was keeping their mouth shut and letting Mrs. Karen keep going. And first of all, anything that came on the television, Mrs. Karen would quickly get influenced by and fully believe. A few years ago, when they said that natto was good for your health, she once stuffed every single inch of the fridge at the family house was natto. According to a story that Mrs. Tammy told me, a long time ago when there was a trend for mushroom iced tea, she left the tea trying to grow the mushrooms herself. And before the mushrooms, there was mold growing everywhere and it turned into a complete disaster. Gross! My goodness, Mrs. Tammy is so logical and intelligent, and it almost shocks me that Mrs. Karen was born from her. I can't help but to think that. Even though Mrs. Tammy is already past the age of 80, she was always inputting new information and skills. And she teaches me about world affairs, as well as economics. And as a cherry on top, she even tells me what kind of songs are trending with the young girls these days. She's a super amazing grandmother.
Oh, what to do? Karen's obsession with lohas is a bit of a problem.
It is, isn't it?
Until now, she's jumped into all kinds of trends. But it seems like this obsession with natural things might be the worst one yet.
Recently, all of the vegetables that she buys at the grocery store are organic, and all of these spices and condiments are ones without any processed ingredients in them. And every single thing that she buys is expensive. Apparently, it's causing an effect on the family finances. They still had the inheritance from my grandfather-in-law, and the house that Mrs. Karen and Mrs. Tammy are living, and now I was left to them by Mrs. Tammy's husband. They didn't have to pay rent, so they must be fairly comfortable financially for the time being. But to be honest, it was the opposite of our family, because we were spending a lot of money on infertility treatment. That's right. My other concern was that even though it's been 8 years since we got married, we still weren't able to have children.
You two, you still aren't pregnant? This is such a problem. If we're never going to be able to get the heir to this family, what are we going to do?
Every single time that we would go back to the family house, Mrs. Karen would complain and make stabs at me, and that was another one of my concerns. Well, children are a treasure, and some of it has to do with luck. I tried to laugh it off, but my face couldn't hide it. Both Kevin and I have been concerned for a while now in regards to the fact that we weren't able to have children yet. And that's why, as a secret from Kevin's family, we had started infertility treatment. Until now, we have tried all kinds of different treatments, but nothing was working. And infertility treatment cost a lot of money. And that's why our household finances were really rough. And for me, not only was I a housewife, but I was also working while going to infertility treatments, and it was difficult. But if I told my mother-in-law that I was going to infertility treatments, I don't know what she would say to me. In particular, this is Mrs. Karen, who was completely obsessed with everything being natural. And there's no doubt that she would get angry that infertility treatment was going against the natural. Mrs. Tammy had a lot of knowledge, so I did want to talk to her about it sometimes. But if Mrs. Tammy were to speak to Mrs. Karen about it, I don't know what kind of disaster it would turn into. So I felt like I had no choice but to stay quiet. What am I supposed to do? I was pretty concerned. However, the day eventually came that Mrs. Karen found out about my infertility treatment. That was when Kevin and I went to his family house the same as usual, and we were having tea in the living room, all four of us together. As usual, I was getting lectured about the Loha's lifestyle, and then she moved on to pressuring me about the pregnancy and complaining about it. Once Mrs. Karen seemed satisfied, she then made a certain request to Kevin.
Oh, that reminds me, Kevin. This weekend, do you want to go and visit your father's grave? The other day, on the day of his passing, your grandma got sick and we weren't able to go. So, wouldn't you mind taking us in your car this weekend?
Oh, I'm sorry. This upcoming weekend, I can't. I have plans to go to the clinic with Paige. So how about the next weekend?
Hey, Kevin. I panicked and tried to stop Kevin from speaking any further. However, it was already too late. The moment that Kevin said the word clinic, Mrs. Karen latched onto that.
Clinic? What, Kevin, are you sick?
Oh no.
Actually, Mrs. Karen, I did my best to cover it up and brush it off, but there's nobody in this world that would be able to stop Mrs. Karen once she started. And after being aggressively pressured by his mother, Kevin broke and she ended up exposing the fact that we were going to a clinic for infertility treatment to his mother.
Did you just say infertility treatment? My, this is unbelievable. That you are infertile? Paige, you knew that you were infertile, and you still fooled Kevin into marrying you?
What? I was extremely shocked at her words. Mrs. Karen decided that I was the only one that was infertile, and then she started pulling all of the blame on me.
Cut it out, Mom! The doctors have told us through tests that neither Paige nor I have any major problems with our fertility.
Well then, why aren't you able to have kids? This doesn't make any sense. Oh my goodness, I can't believe that you can't even get pregnant without getting the help of somebody else. You are damaged goods as a woman.
How awful. Just because I wasn't able to have any children, my mother-in-law was calling me damaged goods, and I could feel the tears welling up in my eyes. I looked to the side to try to cover my tears when I caught a sight of Mrs. Tammy out of the corner of my eye. She wasn't even trying to look over at us, and she was leisurely sipping on her tea. Just like Mrs. Karen, Mrs. Tammy probably doesn't want to look at my face, knowing what she just found out. Mrs. Tammy wasn't even trying to make eye contact with me, and more so than Mrs. Karen's hurtful words, that sent the sharpest pain in my chest.
Because you can't get pregnant naturally. That's why you need infertility treatment. Oh goodness, how awful. Infertility treatment is that thing, right? The test tube babies, the thing where they do what should be God's work and try to force it by the hand of humans? How disgusting! Are you kidding me? There's no way I'm accepting a test tube baby.
Mrs. Karen glared at me with a face that looked like she was looking at the dirtiest thing in the world. I couldn't take it anymore. The tears burst out of my eyes and I tried to fly out of the house. When at that moment...
How dare you? You don't know anything, do you?
Huh?
Mrs. Tammy ignored Mrs. Karen and she turned around to face Kevin and I.
Both of you, how many years have you been undergoing infertility treatment?
What?
Why are you just standing there? So when did you start the treatment is what I'm asking you.
This is our 3rd year. I reluctantly answered, and Mrs. Tammy then nodded her head.
Is that so? Is that so? Well then, that must mean that you already tried different types of treatment. Was your anti-malarian hormone normal? How was the Hooner test? From what I can see, it doesn't seem like Kevin is suffering from NMHH. And if the doctor is telling you that there weren't any problems, then that must mean they've already completed all of the tests and your functions.
What are you saying, Mom? This isn't a time to be blabbing about nonsense.
You shut up! You're the one blabbing nonsense, Karen.
Mrs. Karen had started yapping on the side, but Mrs. Tammy shut her up with her harsh voice. And then she turned back towards us again, and this time with a nice voice.
So, what step has your treatment gotten into at this stage?
After the timing method, I used induction drugs, did a hysterosalpinogram, and did a swim up, but as it turns out, it seems that Mrs. Tammy was understanding all the specific words in regard to infertility treatment. And so I sincerely spoke about all of our treatment up until now. And Mrs. Karen, who was listening on the side, looked completely lost. So now we're thinking about trying in vitro fertilization.
But we're not sure what to do. It's going to cause a lot of burdens on Paige's body, and to be honest, the cost is outrageous too.
It is, isn't it? Well then, why don't you try this?
And then Mrs. Tammy made the most shocking suggestion to us.
Let's get rid of this house, and we can use that money for your in vitro fertilization treatment. With that, you'll be able to solve the problem about the money.
What?
Seriously?
Hey, Mom!
All three of us were shocked at Mrs. Tammy's sudden suggestion. However, perhaps the most shocked out of all of us was Mrs. Karen.
What?
What are you wah-wah-wahing about? What's the problem? In that case, Paige's treatment will progress, and if it goes well, then they'll be able to get pregnant with their first child. Well, although it doesn't change the fact that it's going to be quite the burden on Paige's body.
That's ridiculous, Mom. Why should we have to pay for in vitro fertilization, which goes against anything that's natural?
Even if you say that it's our money, it's not your money, is it? I am just saying that I want to use my money and invest it in somebody that has the same circumstances as me.
The same circumstances?
Because I also became pregnant through infertility treatment, just like Paige. I ended up finally getting pregnant through artificial insemination as a last resort. At the time, the reality of in vitro fertilization didn't exist, which means that you, Karen, were actually born out of infertility treatment that you just said goes against natural methods. And that means that if I had just left it up to nature, like you wished, you wouldn't exist in this world.
What?
First of all, humans have progressed and civilization has developed so far through the ceaseless advancements of technology. It's not only infertility treatment. The cultural lifestyle that you're enjoying so much right now, if you had just left it nature as nature, then you wouldn't be able to have any of that. Humans have been living all these years side by side with nature while also advancing in technology. You have been reaping all of the benefits of those advancements and technology. So who are you to say nature is the only way? If you like nature that much, then why don't you live deep in the mountains and wash your clothes and yourself in the rivers?
After getting scolded by Mrs. Tammy like that, my mother-in-law completely fell silent and shrunk.
Listen, Grandma, we're really grateful that you say you want to help us in our infertility treatment, but when you say that you would get rid of this house, what would you do? That means that the two of you wouldn't have anywhere to live.
Oh, don't worry about that.
Mrs. Tammy grinned from ear to ear.
I'm going to leave enough money so that I would be able to get into a luxury elderly home. I think it's about time that I start relaxing with others my age while being taken care of by the employees there. I don't think that would be so bad. Instead of staying here with somebody who swallows everything she sees on TV, from natto to tomatoes to the Loha's lifestyle, I wouldn't have to listen to that all day anymore.
I couldn't help but to laugh. However, the only person not laughing in the room was Mrs. Karen.
That might be fine for you, Mom, but what's gonna happen to me? Where am I supposed to live?
For you, there is the house way out in the countryside that my husband left for us. I'll give it to you. So why don't you live out your Loha's lifestyle there to your full satisfaction?
The one in the middle of nowhere?
I had also heard about this house in the middle of nowhere that my late father-in-law had left behind. But according to the stories, that house doesn't have electricity or gas, and not even water. And of course, having internet is a dream within a dream. I heard it really is in the middle of nowhere. It's at the top of the road that even cars can't get through. And I heard it's a place that's completely disconnected from any civilization.
There's no way I can live in a place like that.
Oh my. But won't you be able to live out your Loha's lifestyle that you wanted? you'll do laundry in the river and every day cut the grass in the mountains. If you're doing laundry in the river, maybe some peaches will come rolling down the river towards you.
Yeah, I bet. Hey, Mom, if the peaches come rolling down, let me know. I've always wanted to know if the peach fairies actually exist in them.
Heck, all of you!
Mrs. Karen was going into hysterics. Mrs. Tammy shut that down in an instant.
These are all the seeds that you sowed yourself. If you're so obsessed with everything natural, then why don't you start over from scratch in the middle of real nature?
After that, Mrs. Tammy really did sell the house, and she moved into a luxury home for the elderly. And all of the money that came from that, besides what she needed in order to live at the elderly home, she gave it all to Kevin and I. In the beginning, we refused to accept it, but
If it means that I'm going to get to see my great-grandchildren with these very eyes, then that would be the greatest gift to me.
and when she said that, we decided to gratefully accept her gift. As for Mrs. Karen, just as Mrs. Tammy said, she was sent deep into the mountains. She's in a situation with no electricity or gas or water, and it seems like she's really enjoying the great outdoors. She can't even get cell phone service out there, so I don't know what kind of tragic lifestyle she's living over there. 3 months later.
Paige, how are you doing?
Hi, Mrs. Tammy. I'm doing really well.
It really has become a great generation that you can speak to each other over the internet. IT is going to make the world a better place. This is exactly what they mean when they say digital transformation.
Mrs. Tammy and I were video calling each other because we were both connected to the internet at the elderly home and at our house. You're right. By the way, Mrs. Tammy, we have something to tell you.
What is it?
Actually, the results of the in vitro fertilization the other day, we discovered that we're going to have a baby.
Oh my!
On the other side of the video call, Mrs. Tammy was ecstatic. And behind her, I could see the staff of the home panicking.
Is that so? Is that so? Well, thank goodness. Thank goodness. You take care of your body, because that body doesn't only belong to you now, Paige.
Yes, thank you so much, Mrs. Tammy. It seemed that there was a tear sparkling in the corner of Mrs. Tammy's eye, and I felt my eyes starting to well up too.
Well done. In that case, I can't be sitting around like this anymore. I need to live a long life until I can hold my great-grandchild. No, until my great-grandchild's 10th birthday. No, until their 18th birthday. No, actually, until my great-grandchild gets married.
Please do live a long life, Mrs. Tammy. I can't wait for the day that Mrs. Tammy holds her great-grandchild. And imagining what that would look like when the day finally comes, I rub my stomach with a smile on my face.
Thank you for watching! What kind of crazy people will we get to see next? Stay tuned for more!